Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for keeping up with us until now. And please do take your seats. We're going to start the cultural section of our conference now. And I would like to ask you all to join me in welcoming Emeritus Professor in Anthropology and Forced Migration and former Director of the Refugee Studies Center here at the University of Oxford. Please all join me in welcoming Professor Dawn Chatty.
Thank you very much. I have the clock ticking away here, so I might start speaking a little bit faster than I normally would in order to stay with 30 minutes. If I go forward, will I end up on my second image? No, so let me go back. All right, let me just say a few words to begin. As you all know, this is a room with many historians, political scientists, and young people from the region, that the Syria and its humanitarian crisis, if I may call it that, has been in the news for nearly a decade now. But very few know or understand the complexity of displacement, forced migration, integration, and the long era of ecumenical coexistence in the region. So what I hope to show this afternoon is that for Syria, or let's say Bilad al-Sham, the integration of refugees and immigrants in the Middle East has a long history, and that acceptance of the other, though severely dented by the current armed conflict, has not been destroyed. So I'm going to, I think, end on a hopeful note and hopefully bring many of you with me. Contemporary Syria as a modern nation state has been known for its cultural plurality, its local conviviality, and I say it again, its ecumenical cosmopolitanism. Many of its citizens were refugees in the 19th and 20th century and found sanctuary in the territory of Bilad al-Sham. So let me just start with a few reminders that most of you hardly need. I thought I would start with a few images of Syria's long history. I'll just start with Palmyra and the 3rd century Queen Zenobia and her rule over an area that once extended from Cilicia to Egypt. On the right-hand side is, of course, my favorite image on the road to Palmyra, the Bagdad Cafe, spelt this way by the two Bedouin brothers who decided that they would be inspired by the film of that name with Jack Palance. I don't think any of you are old enough to know who he is, but he won the César Award for Best Foreign Film way back in 1987. It was a thriving business the last time I was there on the road to Palmyra in 2011. The next set of images are very, obviously you all know, the Hasn al-Aqrad, the Crac de Chevalier, which was inhabited and extended by the Hospitallers Order of St. John of Jerusalem in the 12th century, and then further developed by the Mamluks in the 13th century. So it maintained some of its Byzantine beginnings in the 10th century, then it's got this Frankish transformation, and then, of course, the Kurdish through the Ayyubids. It kind of tells the story of the multi-ethnic and plural cultural traditions of Syria. If I go on just a little bit more, bear with me, I will show you this image of Damascus, of the Umayyad Mosque, which of course is also the place where the head of St. John the Baptist is meant to be entombed. And in the lower image, that's the picture of the mausoleum where many Christians come to pray. So what I'm just trying to do is give you a sense of a little bit of that multiculturalism and that understanding and acceptance of people from different religious groups and different places from within the region. So I promised Dean that I would be a little bit personal. So I thought I would start by maybe capturing some of your attention with something personal, something to justify why I'm here. So I've put up here two images of watercolor and ink. That one is of the Umayyad Mosque from the inside courtyard, and the other is an image of some of the ulema speaking. We don't know what kind of esoteric ideas they had. But this is the work that goes back to the 1950s. It is the work of a contemporary art group that my mother helped found, and these are two of her images. There are another half a dozen that are in the National Museum of Damascus, so I haven't been able to go back and take photographs of them. But what I do have is one further image I'll give you, which is what I call the one that got away. This was the image of the Taqiyya Suleymaniye that she painted in 1952, and that my father asked her please not to sell, that he wanted to keep it, and for as long as he was alive, he kept it always near him, and apparently it was also a picture that from a very early age I also loved, and it's something that it still hangs in my living room today. I don't think I would ever part with it. So I just put this image up to give you then a sense of, to tell you a little bit about myself. A few people asked today. I was born in New York, so my passport always says born in New York City. I have several different passports. But I was taken to Damascus by my parents when I was about 4 months old, and I lived there until I was 9. And during those years, my parents couldn't quite agree. My mother wanted to enroll me in the American community school, but they wouldn't accept me because my father was Syrian. And after my first day in the Arabic school, and I came home with lots of red marks across my hand, I'm very left-handed, they decided I didn't have to go to school. Which was fun in a way, because I used to accompany my mother whenever she went painting, and I would have to stand guard to make sure that the little boys in the neighborhood or even in the courtyard of the mosque didn't get too close. My job was to chase people away, to be her gatekeeper. But I also began to realize how many different peoples there were in Damascus. Of course, at that age, I was just fascinated by the different kind of dress. And I had a sense of the city in a way that I think an expatriate child wouldn't have, and even a Damascene child wouldn't have. I was pretty much allowed to move around Damascus with my mother as she painted. When I was 9, I guess they both decided I had to start school, and I remember that trip from Damascus to Beirut, to Rome, to Paris, and then across through Greenland to the US. It wasn't a trip I wanted to make. I was angry at the time, and I was very unhappy to start school in the middle of 4th grade and not being able to read. And you can imagine the kind of remedial classes that they were discussing putting me into. Fortunately, I survived remedial reading and continued my education, but all the time I was trying to think of how to get back to Damascus or to Syria in general. Eventually, I took my PhD at the University of California, focusing on Bedouin and the forced settlement of Bedouin in the region. I was able to work with Bedouin in Lebanon and Syria, and a few years later, somehow managed to get a Fulbright award to teach anthropology at the University of Damascus for 2 years. And that was when I thought I really needed to unlock and sort of unravel the mystery of all of these different multicultural, multi-ethnic, sort of ecumenical cosmopolitans in the city. So I'm going to stop here just for a minute to thank Eugene, because I came to Oxford in 1994, actually to Oxford in 1995, actually from the Sultanate of Oman, so I took a detour. And I joined the Refugee Studies Center and began to work with Palestinian refugee youth. And I think it was around 1999, Eugene approached me and said, why don't you write a book about forced migration in the Middle East? Initially, I thought, well, you know, I don't think I can do that. I don't think I can write a book that just talks about the vulnerability, the lack of rights, the awful conditions of being displaced, as I had seen amongst many of the Palestinians in the camps that I had gone to. And it took me, I must admit, it took me a couple of years before I thought, I could actually look at forced migration, at displacement and dispossession in the modern Middle East from a more optimistic perspective. I could go back and try to do some research. I'm not a historian, but I did end up doing a little bit of historical research, but start interviewing the oldest surviving generations of these different groups that I had met in my childhood, but also during my years as a Fulbright professor at the university. So that's how the book Forced Displacement, Dispossession and Displacement in the Modern Middle East came about. I'm going to go over a little bit of that, which will be to talk about these waves of forced migrants of the 19th century, the 20th century, the interwar mandate response, a few words about the early Syrian Republic response, and then also the contemporary response. So a few words that I probably don't need to put up here, but for other audiences, when you say Syria or Bilad al-Sham, they don't really know what you think about. I just thought this 19th century map of Syria, as envisioned by the European cartographer, was interesting to look at because it extends from Iskandarun down to Jebel Arish, and of course it includes Palmyra and the hinterland. It's the entire coast, and of course Mount Lebanon is a kind of semi-independent element of that. So when I'm talking about Bilad al-Sham, I'm really, this is the region I'm talking about. So let me say a little bit about this history. For about 100 years, most of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire and Tsarist Russia fought 6 wars, and these wars were all about the borderland between the Ottoman Empire and imperialist Russia. Russia won all of the wars except for one, and that war is obviously, I think, one that the British study because of the Charge of the Light Brigade and Lord Tennyson's wonderful poem about the 10th Hussars, which my husband's regiment, so I had to learn that poem as well. But the point I want to make about the Crimean War of 1856, we remember Florence Nightingale, we remember that this was the first war that the press actually began reporting about immediately. We also know that this is where the Russian surgeons really refined their ability to amputate without killing the patient. But we tend to forget that there were between 500,000 to 1 million forced migrants, the Muslims of the Crimea, and who were forced out of the region. At this point, many of them remained in the northern or the European part of the Ottoman Empire. But by 1860, the Russians succeeded in defeating the head of the, I'm going to call it the Khanate, the Daghestani, the Sheikh, I've got a pointer here. The Russians succeeded in 1860 in defeating the kind of social uprising in this area, and this was the beginning of the Circassian, the Abkhazi, the Abaza migration out. Most of the migrants at that point went to the Balkans. A few of them came into Anatolia. But now we're looking at 1 million to 1.5 million displaced in a period of just a few years. An amount far outnumbering than those numbers that we've seen in Europe today. By the 1870s, you really had movement now that was beginning to focus on Bilad al-Sham, or focusing on Syria. This was now the last of the Russian-Ottoman wars of 1877-78, where although Bismarck tried to negotiate something that would be acceptable to all sides, he negotiated for Russians to pull back a little bit from the region that they had taken over, but the Russians insisted that all of the Chechen, Daghestani in the Balkans had to move out. And they were moved into Anatolia, but this is when they started moving into Bilad al-Sham, into Syria. That was another 1 million, Chechenian, Daghestani, Abazas, etc. We're also joined by another 50,000 Jews from the Pale of Settlement of Central Europe, which is, unfortunately, it's off the map. So in a period of, let's say, 5-6 years, you had 2 to 3 million people moving out of their homelands into the Ottoman Empire, into the area of Bilad al-Sham. The whole of the Ottoman Empire at that time was about 32 million. So you have to think just about three times the number of Syrians who were accepted into Germany in 2015 came into the Ottoman Empire during this time. So the question is, how did the Ottoman Empire manage this? And this is where in my own teaching in the Refugee Studies Center, they like to say that the modern refugee architecture all started with the Nansen passport in 1920. And I always say, no. It actually started in 1857. So the first code that was set up to deal with mass influx was by the Sublime Porte in Constantinople. And this was the 1857, I call it the Refugee Code, but translation is a little bit difficult. Sometimes it's translated as migrant, because the word is muhajir. So you can take it as you like. But of course, the Ottomans were very instrumental. The whole of their Arab provinces were underpopulated for a number of reasons, and they wanted to get people moving into the area. So there were a number of campaigns that reflected on getting Palestinians to repopulate certain areas, getting Bedouin to settle. But in terms of mainly these Circassians, they encouraged them to settle in certain areas, normally in the region that's called the Marmora, that's between agriculture and the semi-arid land, to kind of stop the fighting between the Kurds and the Bedouin, or the Druze and the Bedouin, and they settled. They gave them a lot of carrots, I think you could say. They exempted the Circassians and the Chechenian from any taxation for either 6 years or 12 years, depending on where they settled. And also they exempted them from conscription into the army, either for 6 years or 12 years, depending where they settled. So the whole point was, let's help these people integrate, get on their feet, and then they can start paying taxes, because the whole point was to try and create a more viable system of tax farming. On top of these numbers, even though they had huge numbers coming in, there was still space. The Ottomans also advertised for migrants under the same code, and they had applicants coming from Switzerland, from Italy, from Bavaria, even from the US. The only other proviso that they put in place was that if they were given land by the Ottomans, they couldn't sell it for 20 years. Now, whether that was to prevent, real estate speculators, or whether it was to keep the tax money flooding in, somebody else will have to find out by reading the texts themselves. So it wasn't very long before the Ottomans moved on from the code to a commission. They also then began to take in large numbers, about 50,000 more migrants from Hungary, from Bohemia, from Poland, and more Circassians and more Tatars fleeing from the lands as Russia was extending further south and east. All of this activity really did begin to revive the local agricultural sector, and the Ottomans then began working with some of the international aid that started to come in to this part of the world, and they actually began to assist all of these new migrants in setting up their farming. All of these communities found ways of integrating, I'm going to say horizontally. They integrated with each other. It didn't really matter what territory you were on. In a way, it reflected the whole millet system, where your attachment was very often to your ethno-religious community. And so only for the Circassians and the Chechenians, because they were Muslim, they found different ways of making themselves be a little bit different by creating or building mosques, which I'm going to call very much in the Byzantine style, which is not really the shape of what most mosques look like in Bilad al-Sham. In the early stages, around 1878, 79, when huge numbers were coming in, of course, all of the mosques, all of the schools, all of the other taqiyas of Istanbul and the major cities were turned into temporary refugee camps. This is an image which really attracted me, because I've been to visit the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. This was Hagia Sophia, which had 3,000 souls in it, with almost every inch of floor covered by them. And one of the reports from the Stafford House Committee was that everybody was kind of bored, and there was absolutely nothing to do except to gossip and to smoke, which makes it sound as though things aren't really that much different. But once they moved out, they were then able to work with the Refugee Commission that became the General Administration for Refugee Affairs in 1877-78. And here, people were actually transported to the plots of land that they were given, and in many cases, they were actually given winter feed supplies, winter heating supplies, and monthly income to last for the first season until they could produce their harvest. I had a hard time trying to figure out exactly how much this weighed on the local community, but I did find one reference which said that during the years 77, 78, 79, 1877, 78, 79, when many of the Circassians were coming and were being settled in the Merj of Zaghouta around Damascus. The Damascene households were being charged 1 piastre a year in order to assist the refugees and immigrants to settle in the local area. The most I can get from this is it's something around 10 pounds a year. So this apparently was not objected to, and most of this community settled very successfully. And they continued, Circassians, Abaza, etc., continued coming from the Caucasus up through until the 1920s, when then the shift was to the Albanians and the Kosovars. So the next wave that really interested me, and I've always been fascinated about this, and on Friday I must see if I can talk to Kerkor later, I was fascinated with the way in which the Armenians were so successful in settling after a genocide, not that many miles to the north of what had once been their home villages, etc. So beginning around the 1890s, the region where the Armenians and the Kurds all lived, which is all in the same area, with Armenians settled in villages and many of the Kurds as herders going up and down as transhumant, many of the Muslims coming in from the Caucasus were beginning to create real unrest and disturbances in the area. And so first there was a trickle, and then later we have the massacres, like the massacre at Sassoon in 1894, and then finally a flood of Armenians fleeing, but fleeing to where? Fleeing to Aleppo, to Damascus, to Jerusalem, to Cairo, where there were already Armenian communities as part of the way in which the Ottoman Empire was set up. So the different millets had this kind of horizontal connections throughout. I don't know how many died, maybe 1.2 million were killed in the genocide, but somewhere around 750,000 Armenians survived, and many of them survived and settled in these major cities of Bilad al-Sham. So after the Armenians, we also have the movement of the Kurds, and these are not the 2 to 3 million Kurds who came to Syria or to Bilad al-Sham with Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, but these are the small group of Kurds who resisted, number one, the carving up of the region under the French. So I'm looking at the yellow arrows here. These are the Kurds who came after the failed Sheikh Said revolt in Turkey in the mid-1920s. These are the Kurds who did not want to live in a secular state, who did not want to see the caliphate abolished. So they decided to leave, and they entered Syria. It wasn't very large numbers, about 10,000, 20,000, and now we believe it's about 200,000 to 300,000. Following the Kurds, there were the Assyrian, who were also integrated, who fled in the early 1920s, mid-1920s, after the British gave up their mandate of Iraq. And we all know in the 1940s, another 100,000 Palestinians also entered Syria. So very quickly, when the French took over their mandate, when they refused to accept the findings of the Inter-Allied Commission of 1919, which recommended that the region should be kept as one country. I'm not sure that they recommended that Emir Faisal should be the king, but he was there at the time. The French rejected that and felt it was their right to come in. So by 1920, the French had their mandate in Syria, and straight away set upon dividing Syria into 6 statelets, or states. This, funny enough, was rejected by the Syrians. They didn't really want to be separated. And you could say that the Arab revolt started in this corner amongst the Druze. So the Arab revolt of about 1922 to 1925 against the French government, but also against being divided up. Most of the inhabitants of Bilad al-Sham were fighting against being divided up. However, the French were able to defeat this uprising after about 5 years, although there was continuous distress. But having said that, one of the very interesting things that the French did, and I think it was something that helped create what is now often called in modern history the refuge state, is they decided that anybody who was in Syria for 5 years, starting from their mandate, would become Syrian citizens. So they granted citizenship to all the Armenians of mandated Syria in the 1920s. And I remember in one of my interviews somebody saying, well, we thought it was rather funny for an Armenian to be an Arab, but maybe he was an Armenian Arab, sort of reflecting on the time. But he said, but after a few years, we got used to them as being Syrians. They also gave citizenship to all of the Kurds who had fled from Turkey and to all the Assyrian Christians who had fled from Iraq. And there was negotiation in 1948 to give citizenship to the Palestinians who had come into Syria, but unfortunately the assassination of Colonel Hosni Zayem put an end to those negotiations. And then just a quick wrap up. You can see, starting from the 1850s to the present time, mass influxes into Bilad al-Sham. I'm going to just use Syria as the biggest example. The thing that I think that I want to prioritize here is that neither Syria nor Lebanon nor Jordan, and really very tight conditions in Turkey and in Egypt, none of them have signed the modern convention on the status of refugees. None of them have signed the international treaty which says that you cannot return somebody who asks for asylum if their country is still in upheaval, and that you must also consider whether or not they can fit the international legal definition of a refugee, somebody who fears persecution on the basis of a number of issues like race, religion, social group, etc. And certainly in the past 10 years, I've often heard people say in very negative terms that, none of these countries have signed the 51 Convention. And it's this kind of negative view. I would say we should look at it a different way. I would say that instead of considering it as something negative, that one of the reasons why none of these states have signed the 51 Convention has been more to do with the fact that providing sanctuary or providing asylum is actually regarded as a duty, as an obligation on individuals, on families, and in these kind of autocratic states, on the state itself. You can use any term you like. You can use karam if you like to sort of indicate this notion that you must be generous, you must be hospitable to the stranger, to the refugee in the region. Going on from this point, I will say that most of the countries of the region have signed what's called the Casablanca Protocol of 1964, which provides temporary protection, first to Palestinians, but it could be extended to others. That means treat them as you would your own citizens, give them health care, give them education. They don't have to become a citizen. They'll go back someday, which is a little bit different from what the 51 Convention provides. The last point, just to bring us up to date, the Iraqis fleeing the failed state after, not 2003 so much, by about 2006, 2007, we know from the figures that about 1.2 million Iraqis entered Syria without visas. And they had access to work, and they had free health care, and they had access to education. They entered Syria as Arab brothers, and even with the situation as awful as it is now, somewhere near 60% of them are still in Syria, as are about 60% of Palestine refugees. So even in this modern era, these forced migrants have been integrated into the economy. Many of them have found ways of creating sustainable livelihoods in the informal economy. This last migration, I think, is particularly interesting. If we think about it in UK terms, it would be almost as though the entire population of Scotland, about 5 million people, had poured into England seeking refuge from some tremendous calamity and then remained for nearly 10 years. You have to ask yourself, how would England be dealing with that now? Of course, there would be grumbling, but at the local level, would it be as pronounced as what we actually see in terms of the local hosting in the region? The numbers in England, I don't even want to go into because they've been so little. So here, a reminder of all of these groups that have come into the region. And again, a reminder of this sense of social duty or obligation to be hospitable to the stranger, perhaps being more important than what international law might require. The need to give, the need to be generous, while those who receive the generosity generally respond with an obligation to give back, with an obligation to reciprocate. So I would say that because of this movement throughout the 19th and 20th century, migrants were actually creating routes that ran horizontally to other communities like them. Borders were blurred, and social and economic ties across with neighboring countries was very strong and significant. And that this blurring of frontiers, as well as the strong ties across newly created borders, helps to explain what I would call the relative success, certainly in the first 5-6 years, of Syrian asylum seeking across international borders. So this is an image that you've all probably seen many, many times. You can see here the density of temporary settlement on Syria's borders. Most of the settlement along the southern Turkish border are people from the region of Aleppo. Jordan is very similar. Most of those who've sought refuge in Jordan are people who have economic kinship ties with Daraa and the region, and Lebanon also very similar. So here you have a region where refugees have no rights, as set out in international law. There's no protection according to international law, but Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, they have all signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says very clearly that a person has the right to seek asylum in another country, not necessarily the first country, but in another country in order to escape persecution. So the states of Bilad al-Sham, or the Levant as a whole, they've all applied various notions of temporary protection, temporary guesthood, but I say that these are derived from social values and the heritage of past centuries' practices. So Lebanon, with nearly a quarter of its population are from Syria, making up the bulk of the construction industry and also the agricultural industry. Jordan, nearly 10% of the population of Jordan now is made up of Syrians who are temporary guests. There have been some efforts to create a kind of compact to provide some kind of work permits for Syrians. I'm not sure that it's much of a success. I don't really want to go into too much of that. And Turkey, which currently has about 4 million Syrians, and the threat maybe of another million if they open up their border to deal with the numbers that have amassed on their border since the government campaign to retake the Idlib province. So just really quickly, let me say a little bit about return, because certainly in the press you read a lot about Lebanon cannot deal with these numbers anymore, Jordan cannot deal with these numbers anymore, Turkey says we won't take any more, and so voluntary return is something that is talked about. And there has been a bit of an element of voluntary return. You can see that from Turkey, there's about 200,000 out of 4 million have returned, been voluntarily returned perhaps. Jordan has about 50,000 that have returned or been returned, and the same with Lebanon. I think it's very premature to talk about voluntary return. I think that well, let's say 94% of all Syrians are either in Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey. This is the region we have to look at in order to think about what will happen in the future. Maybe I can leave some of that to a question and discussion. What I just want to say here is, what I've tried to say is that in order to understand the region and how it's dealt with all the forced migrants of the region, you need to remember its history. I think that the people of the region have not forgotten the population movements of the 19th century, and a lot of the contemporary movements today reflect that. So finding refuge with family, with tribe, or with pre-established networks becomes extremely important, and the generosity at the local level, despite what sometimes you're reading in the press and amongst key politicians, has been enormous. I've seen it in Lebanon, I've seen it in Jordan, I've seen it in Turkey, and I believe that it bodes very well for the future. If people are treated well in their exile, when they return, they're going to maintain good links with their neighbors. So what I find in general is that there has been, despite a lot of what we read, a very high level of accommodation of displaced Syrians in the region. And I do believe it was based on the notions of a social duty to be generous to the stranger, but then also reinforced by some of the principles, for example, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it has nothing to do with the 51 Convention on the Rights of the Refugees. So I would just close here, so I have a little bit of time to take some questions and answers, or maybe some rebuttal. I'm going to stop with maybe the most contentious thing I will be saying here, is that the sectarian vocabulary and focus of much of Western, and I'm going to say also extremist jihadist commentary, is not shared by most Syrians. I think instead Syrians have a far more ecumenical rather than sectarian vision of their society and their future based on their traditions of coexistence. And I say that has not disappeared and that it bodes well for the future. So I stop here and wait for any questions.
I want to thank you so much for this. My name is Salma Nims, and I just want to say, in my PhD, I did a similar map about movements to Jordan. And I had a similar map about the region being one, you know. And I think this should boil to this, you know, all our discussion, because all the bigotry that has been created in the last few years, I don't believe it's natural to us. You know, none of us have pure Jordanian blood. There is no such thing as, I would say, Syrian or Jordanian or Lebanese or Palestinian. And what I want to focus on, which is very important, a couple of years ago, I was at the CSW, and at that time, Sweden had announced that it will close its border to Syrian refugees because it cannot take anymore, because under the convention, they have to give a lot of rights, you know, and so they said we cannot handle it anymore. And then during that session, the Swedish representative said to me, Jordan has not signed the refugee. And I said, you know what? But we have open door policy. And that's the important thing. Jordanians gave their homes at the beginning of the crisis. And maybe you weren't here yesterday, but it is governments that created that narrative of not being able to handle refugees anymore. And it was just an excuse to the failure of development policies and development planning strategies and the results of corruptions of years that is actually affecting their ability to even offer justice, equality to their own people. So now we have to find the reason. I mean, at some point they were discussing how much bread was being consumed by Syrians. And this is unacceptable. And this is sadly governmental language that people who are in poverty in our countries, who are marginalized, find a way to externalize their frustration, because it's an easy thing to externalize your frustration of being marginalized to those who are weak. So I think we really need this narrative, and we really need to move forward, and this is all our jobs. I want to thank you for your work. I'm just saying that we all have this story. We all have Circassians, and they are all part of our, you know, the beauty and tapestry of this region, and we hope it will continue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. No.
Thank you, Dawn, for this wonderful presentation. I want to suggest to you a historical note that may circle the process of migration from the earlier period, which is the absence of North Africa into Bilad al-Sham. In the 18th and 19th century, a large, substantial number of Algerians, Moroccans, Libyans, and Tunisians, but especially Algerians, eventually found their way to Syria, to Palestine and Syria. And this occurred during the Ottoman period. Some of them were migrants of a religious nature, but a lot of them were escaping French colonialism. And what is common to all of those is the highly tolerant nature of the Ottoman regime, in which the Armenian case is an anomaly, because until the First World War, not only Syria, but Anatolia was a large recipient of migrations, beginning after the conquista, after the Spanish Inquisitions, receiving a huge number of North Africans, but also Sephardic Jews into the Romilly and Anatolia. So it's important to see this in the Ottoman context before the First World War.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Sometimes it's hard to find a starting point. I remember reading that during the beginning of the Inquisition, because originally the treaty signed between Boabdil and Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain was that he would leave, he would go into exile as long as the Muslims and Jews were not forced to leave. Of course, that only lasted 10 years. And when they were expelled, I remember that the Sultan in Istanbul said, if they don't want them, we'll take them. So you had this huge wave in the 15th century. And it continued. And I think that's the beauty of the region. That's one of the reasons why this kind of local cosmopolitanism, this conviviality is so deeply ingrained, I think, in all of the peoples of this region, the southern Bilad al-Sham, the Levant region. Thank you.
So, just quick comments added to the previous one. On the map too, there's also maybe an arrow coming from Crete, with when the Ottoman Empire ceded Crete. There was also some Crete Muslims, I think, that got evacuated from Crete and they got resettled on the Syrian coast. And we have a village called Al-Hamidiyya that is also it's called Al-Hamidiyya after Abdul Hamid, the Sultan, who resettled them. And I think they even still speak a kind of Crete Greek dialects to this day.
That's right. No, and they are still there. And many of them, nowadays, they often send their children to university in Greece. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much. This is fascinating by all means. I wanted to ask about actually something that relates to how do you comment on the, I really hate the word, but I'm going to use it, assimilation, post-state. Because currently actually I work on a few projects that concern mental health with Syrian refugees. And we're trying to develop some kind of a structured model to understand how to minimize the mental health-related outcomes throughout the process until you get to the assimilation part. So I would really appreciate your insight on that.
In the UK?
Actually throughout Europe. So basically, the project is dealing with Syrian refugees who went to Greece.
That's a very interesting question, and I think here again we have a lot to learn from whether it was a policy that had been clearly thought out or not is another issue. I think historians can look at this clearly. But the Ottomans were not interested in assimilation. They wanted people to integrate. They wanted them to become economically viable. Once a family, once a household, even today, becomes economically viable, or their livelihood is sustainable, they will maintain their culture. Even though the second and third generation might lose their language because the second generation always wants to be able to speak just like everybody that's around them. But very often the third generation then returns and tries to think, what is my culture? What is my social background? So I would say, and certainly in terms of mental health, you need a community. That community has got to be the community that maybe it integrated a generation before, maybe you've all come over at the same time.
It's quite interesting because we call it collective well-being.
Yes. Exactly, it's collective well-being, yes, and I think this is what we have to work towards. You know, even in the US, you've got this myth of a melting pot, but it was always a myth. Communities remain, you know, Anglo-Irish, Anglo, American, British, German, et cetera, because you need to have your community in order to integrate, in order to basically have economic health, social health, and in this case, general mental well-being.
Well, do you have any more questions? I guess.
It's rather a personal question. You said about the tolerance of the Sultan in taking in the communities. Now, don't you think at times it could have been motivated by self-interest? Now, I come from a Syrian and Circassian background. And now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I read in Wikipedia that the Sultan of the day and the Tsars, although they were sworn enemies on many other issues, but they agreed on one thing, and that is the Tsar wanted the Circassians and the Muslims to get out of that rich, wonderful land, so he wanted to get rid of them. And the Sultan needed Muslims to counterbalance the Greek population in Anatolia. So they made an agreement, and that the Sultan would send imams to villages and towns to brainwash people, telling them, what are you doing here? You've got to go to Sham Sharif, which is, that's where you should be, near the Mecca, and that's much better for you than the paradise that they're living in. So and at the same time, the Tsar was putting a lot of pressure on them, so they emigrated. And that's my perception. Please tell me what you think.
Well, I think it's, again, the historians in this room probably have to answer, but I think you probably have an important point. The Kingdom of Greece is one of these few states created without there really being a war. I mean, there was this constant negotiation, should it be sort of a semi-independent principality of the Ottomans, but somehow under the satellite influence of Tsarist Russia. So, I think the Ottomans were really shocked when eventually they kind of had to agree by 1829 or so that there would be a kingdom of Greece, and there would have been some population movement. So a lot of the Greek Orthodox, some of them, in Anatolia would have moved. So, but within the Balkans, there probably would have been sort of like, well, we're kind of thin on the ground with Muslims. So there wasn't a very, I don't think that the Balkans was really stripped out of Muslims until 1877, 78. And that could be also, you could say indirectly, because of the warlike reputation of many of the Circassians. The Circassians who left and came to the area around the Balkans, many of them then joined the Ottoman military establishment, some of them informal militias, some of them proper Ottoman officers. But their reputation preceded them. And so by the time you get to 1877, 78, you have what William Gladstone called the Bulgarian horrors, in his mind really perpetrated by Ottoman militias, etc., which are the Circassians, so they get pushed out again. I think there's a lot of history that needs to be explored about the Circassian movement, because it continued from around 1860 up until the beginning of the 20th century, and there were many different, you could say many different causes or reasons why families would decide to move. But there was a time when the Russian and the Ottomans both hired steamships to move people out across the Balkans. So they both worked together to get the moved out, yes.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, but please join me in welcoming Professor Don Chatty. Thank you so much for joining us.